Welcome everyone. I'm Miriam and I will be moderating the session, so any questions afterwards, wait for me to run up to you with the microphone. We're here with Cooper Thompson about FHIR implementations at scale.
Yep, thank you. And welcome everybody. So I guess first there are several dimensions of FHIR scale, and I'll touch on a few, but I kind of had to pick some of my favorites to talk about. But I guess first a little bit about me. So I'm an integration engineer at Epic. And my day job is helping our customers deploy, troubleshoot, support FHIR integrations. And I've been pulled into probably like hundreds of FHIR integration projects over the years, which is actually a relatively small number compared to how many we have across the company. So I'll explain this chart in a sec, but we have around 10,000 FHIR integrations live in production. And the way I count integration is like one app connecting to one of our health systems. So this graph just kind of shows the volume of integrations we have per customer. So each column represents one of our customers, one of our health systems, and then we show how many of each type of integration we have. So on some of our customers have as much as 60, 70, 80 live FHIR integrations in production, and on average that comes out to about 22 per health system. And in terms of API volume, that comes out, that's around like 74 billion API calls over the last year. And this is the breakdown you can see by app type. So for patient-facing apps, staff-facing apps, which is like EHR launch for nurses and physicians, and then backend. So it's interesting to see, but probably not surprising, that while there are fewer backend app integrations, they make up kind of a larger chunk of the actual API volume. So that's kind of one aspect of scale that we deal with. Another one is that even though most folks probably think of Epic as having a primary market being like health systems, that inpatient, outpatient facilities, we actually serve customers in a broad range of settings. So we have payers that use our software for health plan management. We have diagnostic labs that use us as the lab system. We have public health labs. And of course, we do have plenty of health systems that use us for inpatient, outpatient, but it's really more than that. So across all of those different care settings, we kind of have a common pattern for like building a FHIR integration. And this is probably unsurprising to a lot of folks, but Epic or really NHR develops the FHIR APIs. Apps either develop or enhance their product to use those APIs. And then healthcare organizations have to deploy those. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that healthcare organization deployment activity, because that's kind of essential in making sure you're rolling out FHIR integrations in a scalable way. So this is an example of like a project plan, like the tasks that are involved in deploying a FHIR integration. And there's a lot of steps, and I'm going to jump through a few of them. So first, like contracting. Like there's nothing about FHIR versus V2 versus NCPDP that changes how contracting works, right? You have to sign contracts, business associates agreement in the United States, et cetera. And honestly, contracting is across all of our integration types, including FHIR, is honestly one of the biggest risk areas for going live. So it's not setting up OAuth, it's not getting FHIR working, it's getting contracts signed. Some of the things like performance impact analysis, like will the API volume that this app is going to add to your ecosystem require new hardware? Workflow analysis, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but standing up test systems, doing connectivity testing, that's usually where like OAuth 2 type troubleshooting happens. Workflow testing, making sure that when an app is embedded in the EHR and there's a nurse going through the workflow, that it's kind of seamless and works as expected. If you have to train your end users, right, you have to build training materials, schedule classes, get time out of people's schedules to attend those classes, cutover planning, and then optimization. You go live, and then after you go live, you have to address any issues you didn't get to before go live. And then you get into the repeat forever cycle where like either Epic may make updates to our APIs that apps have to account for, or apps have their own enhancements or bug fixes. So there's the repeat forever maintenance cycle. So like this is, the point here is like there's a lot of steps in deploying any sort of integration, including FHIR, and it's a lot of work. And I mentioned we have like the 10,000 FHIR integrations. Like it's not like you necessarily have to do this for every one of them, but it's a lot of work. And I think one of the things we've realized is that this is meant to represent like point-to-point integrations, right? Every app has to connect to every health system, and every one of those connections, when you're doing point-to-point, requires running through that same project plan. And as an industry, we of course recognize that a network-based model kind of mitigates this significantly. where each participant, when they join the network, or possibly when they onboard for a new purpose of use for the network, would run through that project plan once. And so one thing I'll mention, like even for TEFCA type exchanges, any network exchanges, you still have to run through that project plan, but it is just once per network participation. And one thing I realized was that, if you're familiar with Epic's patient-facing app integration strategy, where app developers can go to FHIR.epic.com, to our developer portal, and create an app, and then that can connect to every health system. It's actually, like our patient-facing app ecosystem is actually a network. Apps join the network. We actually had all of our health systems join the network, and that really reduced the amount of friction it took for apps to get connected to each health system. So I'm going to change gears a bit and talk about deployment footprint, because this can impact FHIR content. So a lot of folks kind of think of things with this model. So I have like a few example USCDI data classes, and a lot of folks are like, oh, EHRs are deployed like this, right? They have Epic is the EHR, we have scheduling, registration, outpatient, inpatient, lab, billing, all of those are done in Epic. So when you're querying for USCDI data, for example, or AUCDI or MedMy content or whatever, you'll get that in the FHIR API. And this is a pretty common deployment pattern where you can expect to get most USCDI from the FHIR data, from the FHIR API, but it's not really the only pattern. So here's a different pattern that does exist, which is that some health systems may choose to use a different system for registration or scheduling or lab. And what this means is that if you're hitting like the EHR's FHIR endpoint, that FHIR endpoint may not have access to coverage data because the coverage, the health insurance information is stored in a different system. Or maybe even worse, if you're expecting the coverage information to be there, is the EHRs may have some subset of that insurance information. Like we may pull in some insurance from the registration system so that when we send a lab order to some reference lab, we can include the coverage for that, but we may not have the full picture. Another interesting nuance for some of these deployment options is, I use an example of billing and procedures. So, a clinical EHR, like if you're using an EHR for inpatient or outpatient care, that'll usually have a record of all the procedures the patient has had, right? But if you're using external billing, the CPT codes for that procedure may not be in the EHR. So you may be able to query for procedures, but they may not have CPT codes on them. So I wanted to kind of describe this situation so that folks are aware of the different ways that health systems, different ways health systems can choose to deploy their health IT ecosystem and how that can impact the content that you'll get in FHIR APIs. And so of course the solution here is if you're building an app and you want to scale that across all of the health systems in the country, you need to spend some time to know or discover the deployment ecosystem that for the exchange partner. Like if they're doing all products in Epic, that's great, but if they have some of their data is in different systems, that'll be important for you to know. And workflows can be relevant too, right? Like if nurses do different workflows in different systems, that can also impact how data shows up in the API. And then of course, another way to solve that is just testing, like testing with each deployment and then doing regression testing as things change can help mitigate this. So this is kind of changing gears again, but I wanted to talk about one of the strategies we use for just doing data integration at scale, which is something we call the Data Exchange Toolbox. So I'm going to start with this meme, which is like, hey, Cooper, super bold, coming to FHIR DevDays and showing this meme with I want to use FHIR. But a lot of times we like to think of the problem like this. So rather than saying I want to use FHIR, give a problem statement that's healthcare oriented, right? Like I want to access the patient's medication list so I can generate educational materials. And so when we have a problem statement like that, our customers and us can help kind of figure out which technology is the best for that use case. And increasingly, the FHIR family of products is kind of our go-to answer for new integrations. But there are plenty of other standards-based integration technologies out there that may be a fit in some cases. But when I said the FHIR family of products, obviously that's FHIR REST API, bulk FHIR, CDS hooks, FHIRcast, some others. I wanted to kind of talk about some of the diversity we see in the FHIR specification landscape, because when you say FHIR family of products, that's really a pretty big family of things. So spec diversity in FHIR is something that I kind of first encountered when Argonaut did a survey during COVID for scheduling. So we we wanted to get patients in to get their COVID vaccine, and we wanted to figure out what EHRs had in terms of capability for scheduling vaccine appointments. And so we asked a bunch of EHRs, and all the EHRs came back and said, here's what we support. And many EHRs actually supported a way to do this for FHIR, but they all did it differently. So for example, Epic, we support the Argonaut dollar fine, dollar book operation. So dollar fine to get availability, dollar book to schedule the appointment. Other HRs were doing a slot search to get availability, an appointment create to book it, or an appointment search for proposed appointments, and then you just update that appointment to book it. And then since then, we've seen even more options where you can do a slot search to find availability and then a FHIR message to actually book it. We see the same thing in referrals where some folks are using like a REST push, like STU3 procedure request.update to submit a referral to a system. Some use messaging and subscriptions, or REST plus messaging, or a task notification, or REST callback. Even in the patient experience, in patient access space, we see variations. So in the US, we're used to like US Core plus Smart on FHIR. But in the Netherlands, they have this MedMy program, which has a separate set of profiles with a JOT claim-based approach using DevDays, which is their national kind of authentication solution. And then other countries use like a method of like pushing FHIR data from EHRs into a central HIE that has a patient portal that patients can use. So even in the patient access space, there's variability. E-prescribing, there's at least 3 different things I'm aware of that are doing trying to use FHIR for e-prescribing, and they're very different approaches. So I think like in terms of FHIR divergence, like in the past we've talked a lot about apps struggling with variation of how servers implemented FHIR. And I think like as a server, we're also kind of starting to struggle with the variance that we see across IGs. So one of the things that we're kind of focused on to help mitigate that are international realm IGs like IPS and IPA. So IPS is International Patient Summary, IPA is International Patient Access. So with solutions like these, even if the different countries have, or even different realms within a single country have different solutions that are slight variations of this, having a single pattern for a given use case is really helpful for us to scale across different jurisdictions or different agencies within even a single jurisdiction. So yeah, I mean, just kind of to summarize, I guess I'm a little bit ahead of time, which is nice. So our experience is that just the healthcare ecosystem is very complex and very diverse, and accommodating that diversity across a lot of different dimensions is kind of essential to building and deploying FHIR at scale. So I got through that pretty quick, so I think I have plenty of time for questions.
Are there like API limits? Like how many calls can I make before somebody knocks on my?
It kind of depends. Well, there's a lot of factors there, right? So one is like, are they distributed across time, or is it Tuesday at 2 p.m. in the afternoon, or is it midnight? So I don't know. There's a lot of factors.
Thousands, hundreds,
Per second. So one thing. So actually, I was thinking about talking about this. So one is like, working with the health system that you're connecting to. If you're going to do a high volume of queries, is essential. They can plan for the volume. Like knowing ahead of time that a certain high volume amount of queries is coming is very, very useful. But also one thing that I didn't talk about was we have 74 billion API calls per year. I want to cut that down a lot. And it turns out that 8 of our top 10 APIs by volume are read APIs, where folks are doing reference resolution. And so there are actually two approaches folks can use to cut our API volume significantly, which is using include, so they don't have to actually chase their own references, or doing what I call aggregated reference resolution, where instead of every time you see a location reference, you dereference it. You just say, oh, let me, for the course of the, do a full set of queries, figure out the same location is referenced 100 times, then only dereference it once. So patterns like that, I think I strongly encourage to keep our API volume reasonable.
And we did that so far, but still
Nice.
Nobody's asked me to dial it back yet, so
Yeah.
I was kind of surprised.
We do keep an eye on, and there have been cases where we do follow up with folks and say, hey, your API volume, and usually it's not, necessarily Epic directly, but the health systems that are hosting the FHIR servers. There have been cases where API volume has been significantly high, and we've either sometimes, I think once I've heard of a case where we shut off access because it seemed just like a bug, and then we reached out and figured out like what we should do. But normally it's like, hey, what's going on? Can you please coordinate with us?
Yeah, awesome stuff. Like it. If you had your wish, how could we start to address some of that diversity? Do you have any thoughts, conjecture? I'm kind of putting you on the spot. I apologize.
Yeah.
So you feel free to push me off till later, but.
I mean, I think the IPS, IPA, so in some sense, like FHIR is an open spec. So the diversity is a result of just human creativity having access to this spec. But I think there are like significant benefits to like having at least a target folks can shoot for. So IPS and IPA are good targets. So finding other areas where we can at least have a single pattern, even if profiles are different by a little bit. But like the exchange model variation is actually like almost more painful than the profile variation. So IPS and IPA, like they establish here's the exchange model for this type of use case. So more of things like that would be helpful. Thank you. Yeah, Brett, this will be a good one.
Hey, thanks, Coop. It was awesome. The scheduling, of course, made me like scratch my head a little bit, in a good way. Of like, part of the reason we saw that variation is a lot of the vendors had done development in their own pathways and had kind of solved it their own ways. How do you put the toothpaste back in the tube when like several vendors have solved it and aren't necessarily psyched about redoing the work?
In some sense, like putting the toothpaste back in the tube is hard, and like what's past is past maybe. And so it's like for the new stuff we're building, having a pattern so that it just doesn't get worse. Yeah, so like stop the bleeding sort of thing. And healthcare, but yeah, sorry. Yeah, so for new types of integrations that we're building, like CGM and device stuff, like having one target that we can use, one pattern we can use for a lot of different things is a good approach in my mind.
This might be heresy in FHIR. You talk about your clarity, the relational aspect to access data?
I mean, I guess, yeah, in terms of our data exchange toolbox, like I did only list the standards-based options that we support because this is a standards conference and I felt that was most appropriate. Like we do have our own proprietary options, but we really try hard for new types of integrations to focus as much as we can on standards-based integrations and only offer like our proprietary formats like Clarity when there isn't a standards-based option or there isn't a standards-based option yet. So I don't know. I'm not going to go if you want more details about Clarity, I know we've talked before, but I'm not. Yeah.
Hey, you said that in scenarios where like you anticipate needing like a high amount of throughput to a health system's API, it's helpful to communicate to them. Could you recommend a way to go about doing that? Is there like an API-based way? Do I just need to like hunt someone down on LinkedIn and like email them? Like how to go about like reconciling that?
And I think there's really like two paths, right? One is if you're a patient-facing app that can just connect without being affiliated with a health system, that's great. We love that pattern, but usually you'll just be querying for data about just that patient, so your API volume is usually not going to be high enough for us to be that worried. Where API volume really becomes a problem is when you're querying for large populations of patients or doing like, short, like polling on a short time frame. And usually for those sorts of integrations, there will be a contract, right? So you'll have a direct relationship with the healthcare organization, and whoever signed the contract is at least a starting point you can reach out to like get to the right person in the IT team to figure it out. So there really are two different paths, patient-facing versus non. The unaffiliated patient-facing versus everything else.
We have time for one final question, maybe.
How much of underscore include do you support currently?
So for S23 and R4, or at least R4, not DSU2, but for R4 we support include I think for just about everything, one level deep. Casey, does that sound right? So like if you want to like chain down into like include and then include, but we pretty much support include for one level deep for just about all of our 4 APIs at least.
Okay, thank you. That was all we have time for now, but thank you so much,
All right.
Cooper.
Thank you.